Imam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaykum as-salam.
We've been going through some important discussions and explorations of arguments. Currently, we've been discussing about arguments that stand in opposition to the existence of God. And not just arguments, but concepts that seem to give people issue with their faith in God. And today, I think I want to share with you, and I want to hear from you on one of those struggles that honestly, it really does make me feel sad, and it makes me feel for the folks that are struggling like this. I'm talking about what is commonly referred to as the LGBTQIA movement, folks that are struggling perhaps with their desires, homosexual desires, or folks that are struggling with their sense of identity, identifying as male or female, etc. And I want to bring up not just those who are struggling themselves, because this is a struggle for them to have faith. Mm-hmm. But also, I think there's a much larger group of people out there who don't struggle themselves, but perhaps they know someone, or perhaps they simply want to sympathize with people, and they see others
be supportive or
right,
whatever.
exactly.
Right.
They just want to be helpful. They don't want to be harmful. They understand that these folks might be going through something difficult, and don't want to be harsh or mean in some way. And somehow
many kids that come from families of faith,
right,
they grew up in a school system with a lot of friends, and they've loved those friends for so many years, right. And then one day in high school or whatever, this friend comes out as gay or whatever, and then you find those kids are torn. They know that this behavior is against their faith, yet they're still trying to be supportive of their friends. It's a huge dilemma.
And by the way, those kids are themselves taught by that faith to be compassionate, to be loving, to
Exactly.
be kind, and that's absolutely true. Mm-hmm. But are unsure of how to reconcile with what their faith teaches them, with what people seem to be desiring and what people seem to be claiming about themselves.
And this seems to be one of the greatest dilemmas of our time, that is for sure.
What is it that has made this such a struggle? It seems to be such a big deal. Has it always been such a problem?
I mean, not for the matters of faith in particular. I mean, in these conversations, we're basically examining the cases for God and refuting the cases against God. Mm. And homosexual behavior or all of that has existed, for as long as humanity existed. There has always been, an element of sexual unorthodoxy, in the way we practiced intimacy. It has always been a small percentage of human beings, but it did exist, and it never posed a threat to faith. It never posed a case against God. It was always considered a sin. It was always something that society, may have looked down upon. In fact, there has always been instances where violence was exacted on people like this, and this has been extremely unfortunate. But that has been the reality, and people usually practice those things in secret and private. Only in this age, right. Where it is being portrayed as an alternative for faith. If I feel these desires and religion tells me otherwise, then religion must be wrong, basically. Only in the modern age, where homosexual behavior or transgenderism or whatever, they're now being used as a justification of godlessness, and that is extremely unfortunate.
And are we supposed to approach this with, how are we supposed to approach this? Are we supposed to be upset and angry at this issue? Are we supposed to be confronting people who have these feelings? What's the approach?
I think that the proper approach is compassion. The proper approach is being objective. The proper approach is to not judge the people, but I think that we live in a free society where we are not only entitled, I think we're encouraged to judge behavior and to ascertain the morality of behavior. And so we need to, I think, to make a bit of a distinction between what the people themselves and what they do, in order for us to still be able to say the truth and at the same time act compassionately.
So it seems to me that there is a kind of, we talked about this before, a kind of syllogism, born from some of the binaries that are problematic that most people are operating with, and I'm going to try and explain it. It seems that the idea is that that God or religion or a religious text will say that a certain behavior is wrong or immoral, and the individual will then feel the desire to act with that certain behavior. Therefore,
religion is wrong, or God doesn't
exactly,
exist. Right.
Exactly.
And we've talked before about how syllogisms can be extremely dangerous and how these binaries can be extremely dangerous. And it's ironic to me that only when it comes to homosexuality that desire is pinned or pitted against God, whereas with every other type of behavior that we commit, it's never black and white like this.
Right.
And there is something extremely erroneous about this assumption, about this thought process. Number one, as you react to a particular law that you disagree with,
right.
A law that you should think is too harsh or too demanding, we usually don't assume that the lawmaker is absent.
Like
we don't assume that the lawmaker does not exist, right? And so, you know, if you live in California and there are certain traffic laws, and so you disagree with the imposed speed limit, but you never say the state of California doesn't exist. You know, the legislature doesn't exist. Oh, because I don't like this particular rule, that means the rule maker is not in the picture.
Right.
We usually try to negotiate. We try to change the rule. We try to understand where the rule comes from. The assumption, I think, in the modern day ethos of homosexuality or you know, this type of behavior in general is that I possess this desire. Right. Religion tells me that this desire is unacceptable, therefore religion is wrong. Not only that religion is wrong, God doesn't exist.
I think it's interesting also that this is not the only desire. There are other sins, right? There are other behaviors that religion will say is wrong. I don't see the same type of attitude with those other sins.
No. In fact, we tend to return to God in repentance. We tend to ask God for forgiveness whenever we make a mistake and so forth, but only with regards to this particular behavior that it seems that we are so eager to be dismissive of God. But it's not just that. I mean, I've always also noticed, you know, as I think deeper and deeper about the philosophy of homosexuality, is that the assumption here is that desires are innate. Desires also always come from inside. It's natural to me. Right. When in reality, more often than not, desire is actually borrowed from outside and external factors. Sometimes desire is imposed on us. Desire is imposed, preference is imposed on us by society, by culture, and so forth. You know, we don't desire something if we've never heard of it before. Right. And so sometimes much of that is culturally determined, and you know, I don't know why people don't think about that.
You see something in a commercial you've never seen before, and then all of a sudden it's so desirous to you. But before that, you had no idea, no care. Your life would have been fine without it.
Absolutely. Moreover, you know, I also noticed that the assumption here is that it is only desire that drives good behavior. So I have the desire, if someone says I have the desire for homosexuality, acting upon that is the only proper course.
That would be good behavior.
That would be good behavior, but I mean, wait a second. Sometimes listening to our mentors is what drives good behavior.
Right.
Sometimes listening to religious teachings is what constitutes good behavior. Sometimes going against that desire is what constitutes good behavior, and then, you know, later on we look back and say, oh, thank God, you know, my mentors and my family or whatever, they stood against me and they said, don't do this, it's not good for you. Back then I did not realize that, but today I'm fully accepting of this. It's fascinating, you know, how this plays out. There is a complete collapse of logic, is what I'm saying, when it comes to, you know, LGBTQ ideas. A complete collapse of logic. And a complete prohibition on any form of engagement whatsoever. We can't even have honest conversations about it.
Right. I think it's still fair to say, though, that this crisis of faith, this kind of a crisis of faith, has found a home in the LGBTQ movement. And I'm interested to hear from you. What do you feel are the primary driving factors behind this issue? I
would say homosexual ideation and transgender ideation. You know, I think these are the two main drives, you know, in the entire movement. And as far as our conversations about God are concerned, I think we need to focus on those two.
So I think when you say homosexual ideation, you mention homosexuality, and people of faith, many people actually will immediately cringe, and they will say, okay, well, that's just wrong, that's immoral, that's, prohibited, etc. How are we supposed to understand this?
I would say that people of faith need to be a little bit more nuanced. It is true that homosexual acts are religiously prohibited. I think that's a given. You'll find this in every scripture. You'll find this in every corpus of religious law. But I think when it comes to homosexual desires, we more often than not we cannot control our desires. Someone desires certain illicit things in their minds. There is no place in religious teachings where it ever said that God will hold you accountable for your thoughts and your feelings. What matters is whether or not you act upon those thoughts and feelings.
Right. I think it's easy to forget that sometimes, but it is the action that we're held accountable to, not the thoughts that cross our minds.
Exactly.
Well, I think some people will respond and say, well, it's not just a thought that crossed the mind. It's natural to somebody. It's hereditary. It's part of who they are.
And if you say hereditary, then you really have to make a case and identify the actual chromosome and the actual gene that determines homosexual behavior. And you need to show us, in a robust genetic argument, that this is passed down from one generation to the other, which is something that science to this day, was not able to achieve. There is absolutely no evidence that suggests that homosexuality is genetically determined. And if someone argues that, then the burden of proof is really on you.
Right.
But I would even venture to say, even if science discovered the homosexuality gene, right, that still creates a predisposition. It still creates a tendency towards a particular type of behavior.
Right.
It does not determine action.
It does not require them to.
It does not require the action. It only inspires or predisposes the action. And so, even if you have the homosexuality gene, which, like I said, doesn't exist, but
Right.
even if you do have it, you still have a choice to make, right? There are people that are predisposed to enjoy smoking. There are people that are predisposed to do shoplifting because actually the shoplifting gene has been proven scientifically, right? It doesn't. We as a society still think that this is criminal behavior. People who have a tendency to enjoy sexual relations with children, we call them pedophiles, even though science is almost in agreement that pedophilia is genetically determined. But we still think that this is criminal behavior and has to be punished. The mere existence of a predisposition does not justify action. We still have a choice to make at the end of the day.
And it reminds me, actually, even according to many of these moral theories, even heterosexuality must be prohibited and held within certain restrictive.
Well, heterosexuality is not necessarily prohibited. I hope it's not
prohibited. Within certain
it needs to be refined. The behavior, sexual behavior still needs to be regulated. Whether you're heterosexual or otherwise. If you're heterosexual and you are fully healthy, an adult in your mid-20s, but you're not able to find a partner, you can't get married, that's not a justification for you to be imposing yourself on someone. We consider that to be criminal behavior.
Right.
So there's someone that is a perfectly healthy heterosexual male that may actually live their entire lives, without that relationship, because they could not find the partner. So the mere existence of heterosexual desires did not justify you going around and doing inappropriate things.
So the right thing to do for that person, or even in this case for those who feel the homosexual desires, is to be celibate. But that seems to doom them to celibacy.
It does not. I mean, if you care about God, if you care about God's teachings, if that matters to you in any way, shape, or form, then perhaps celibacy is the way to go, and that is the trial that you have to live with for the rest of your life. Just like someone has Crohn's disease, or someone has another congenital anomaly or whatever, a heart problem that they have to live for the rest of their lives. That's God's decree upon you.
So perhaps it's the hypersexualization of our current culture that has brought this particular struggle to seem as though it's
to be an existential struggle.
Right.
I mean, we don't need sex. If you think about it, sex is a good thing, it's a desirable thing, it's a pleasurable thing, but sex is not required for survival. Well, it's required for the survival of the kind, but it's not required for the survival of the individual. You can live a healthy life that is absolutely fulfilled well, not absolutely fulfilled, relatively fulfilled perhaps, without engaging in sexual relations.
And there'll be other people who are not fulfilled in other ways in their lives as well, right?
I mean, I keep thinking of someone who's quadriplegic, for example. You know, that person sits on a wheelchair all day long. That person will never experience sex ever. You know, or someone that has a tumor, you know, in their sex organs, for instance, and never has the desire, you know, to be with someone. That person will never experience sex for the rest of their lives, and that is God's decree upon them.
People will still say that you know, some people are predisposed. It's, you know, it's either that they have homosexual desires or they have heterosexual desires. How are we to respond to this?
They're predisposed.
They're predisposed to homosexual behavior. They're predisposed to homosexual desire. That this is a part of who they are, whether there's a gene or not. It's them, and they want to act on this behavior.
Right, and I say that, you know, if you have any recognition of God, if you were not able to rule God out of your life, and if you could not find a sound argument to remove God from your existence, then you're stuck with the presence of God. And then you're stuck with God's laws, and you have to find a way to work around that.
Right, but then why would they go through the trouble? Why do they have to put themselves through all this suffering and difficulty?
I acknowledge that they are going through this difficulty. I acknowledge that they're going through this pain, but at the end of the day, they still have a choice to make.
Well, this is helpful, I think, but I think some will still ask, why are we seeking to stop other people from doing what they desire?
I'm not trying to stop anyone from doing anything. We're just having a conversation about whether or not homosexual behavior is moral. I disagree with homosexual behavior, and I think that it is both religiously prohibited and immoral. And that's a statement, you know, and I will bear the consequences of this statement, and I'll stand behind the statement. And I also believe that gambling is immoral. I believe that prostitution is immoral. I believe that extramarital affairs or premarital affairs are immoral. I believe that alcoholism is immoral. These are all actions that seem to be legal or have been legalized by society, yet both philosophically and religiously I believe that they're wrong, but I don't carry picket signs and go to the casino, you know, asking that it should be shut down. I mean, maybe I should, but you know, I don't do that. All we're trying to do here is to demonstrate that a particular behavior is wrong, and we're not making a statement about the people that practice that behavior.
So let's just to bring all of this together back to the idea of faith. It seems that one of the excuses that are used by folks to stray away from faith is that this desire is natural to me, I feel it within myself, someone will say, and then therefore and God is restricting me from this desire, so I should just reject God. The same way they would say, you know, if God is restricting me from drinking water and I need water to live, then I should just reject God or reject that faith tradition.
So this is actually a very good question, and you know, I think this is the crux of our conversation here. If someone is able to show that religious requirements and the ability of human beings to live a natural, good life are contradictory, then we're able to reject those religious requirements. If we can show that religious requirements and rationality are contradicting each other, then perhaps, you know, this would be justification to dismiss religious requirements and to say religion is wrong or God doesn't exist. But if we're able to show that religious expectations and rational expectations, if we're able to show that religious requirements and philosophical understandings are compatible with each other, if I can make a case that homosexuality is both prohibited religiously, but it's also philosophically immoral, then there would be no excuse for us to just simply dismiss God and say religion is wrong.
I think such a case deserves attention if we can do that now.
Absolutely. And I would like to do that by borrowing from, you know, natural law theory. A natural law theory was propounded by philosophers throughout time, and one of the most powerful and arguments that bears a tremendous amount of common sense, and I think most people would agree with natural law theory. And in natural law theory, just to use layman's terms and just be as straightforward and simple as possible, natural law theory basically says that every object came to existence to perform a primary function. Every object exists in order to perform a primary function. And the most moral thing to do is to use the object in a manner that enhances that primary function, and that the usage of the object in a way that would frustrate or impede its primary function would be immoral. That is the essence of natural law theory. And our dear friend Thomas Aquinas, that we've talked about so many times before, propounds the perverted faculty argument, which basically is inspired by natural law theory in order to make a case against homosexual behavior.
Could you give us an example first of the natural law theory, the idea of something's primary function versus maybe a secondary functions?
I'll pick the peach tree, for example.
That sounds amazing.
Do you have any peach trees in your backyard?
I wish I did.
All right, so neither do I. But let's say that someone in their backyard, they have a peach tree. What is the primary function of the peach tree?
It needs to yield peaches.
That's it, right? Does that mean there are no other functions of the peach tree?
I mean, I think I'll like for it to have shade, and there might be a bird that sits on it. There might be other functions.
Or maybe cut off some branches and use them for firewood, or maybe put a little bench or something under the shade of that tree in order to enjoy. Maybe put a little bird feeder thingy,
right.
Or maybe even carve a little heart and put your first name and your wife's first name or something like this. These are all accepted functions of the peach tree.
Sure.
I can come up with maybe 15 other functions. But what is the primary function of the peach tree?
We need good peaches.
That's it. And if the peach tree is able to perform all the other functions except yield peaches, we can never call this a good peach tree. Right? We're just going to say I have this weird tree in the backyard that's just doing weird things. I'm cutting this thing down and making it into firewood.
Right.
And so the only way we can characterize the peach tree as a tree, as a good tree, is when that peach tree yields peaches. It can still have other functions, and that's okay. But the usage of that peach tree should never happen at the expense of its primary function or in a manner that impedes the tree from achieving its primary function. That's what natural law theory would say.
So please share with us the way in which natural law theory propounds an argument against homosexuality that is not dependent on faith.
So that's Thomas Aquinas. That's the perverted faculty argument. And Thomas Aquinas basically uses natural law theory, and he says an object is only orderly, meaning moral, good, if it is used in a manner that enhances its primary function.
Right.
And then he says, this is premise number one. Premise number two, any use of an object that frustrates its primary function is disorderly or immoral. And then he would say, premise number three, the primary function of the sex organ is the generation and education of life. You cannot just generate life and then let the cubs, be eaten by the hawks. Right. So, parents in every single environment in the world, in life in general, they produce life and then they care for that life and they nurture that life until that life is able to stand independently on its feet.
Particularly humans, and we would do so for 18, 25 years.
Exactly. And so the primary function, premise number three, the primary function of the sex organ is, number one, the generation of life, and number two, the education of life. Premise number four, homosexual acts directly impede and frustrate the ability of the sex organ to achieve its primary function, which is the generation and education of life. Therefore, the conclusion is homosexual acts are disorderly or immoral. That's basically the perverted faculty argument.
Well, this sounds really powerful. I just want to make sure I have this straight. So, an object has a primary function, and it needs to, in order for the use of that object to be considered moral or orderly, it must not frustrate that primary function.
Absolutely.
Not suspend or use in other ways, but particularly to frustrate, to make impossible that primary function.
Absolutely. And again, one of the usages of sex is pleasure. But it is not the primary. It's not the primary function of sex. The primary function of sex is procreation and the education of life. We're talking about nature's purposes here, not our purposes. Maybe our purposes would just be pleasure, but nature's purposes, God's purposes, would primarily be procreation, the generation of life and the education of life. as long as you're achieving other secondary functions in a manner that does not frustrate the primary function, you're okay.
Right.
So you can still pursue pleasure from sex as long as it does not impede its primary function.
Right.
Which seems to be impossible to do when someone is engaged in a homosexual relationship.
But what about someone who will say a homosexual relationship within the context of marriage, that these people are, they're getting married and they're raising families and raising children, maybe they're adopting children, etc. Wouldn't that be acceptable then?
Natural law theory would inform our response with regards to that as well. If we're able to establish that marriage/family has an objective reality of its own, then we should be able to argue for a primary purpose or a primary function. And if a homosexual marriage frustrates the function of a family or the function of marriage, then we are able to still argue that this would be immoral. And it's not easy, it's not difficult to show that or to demonstrate that there is an objective reality to marriage or a family, right? And so, for example, if you put 5 rocks together, can that constitute a family?
It would be strange to call it a family of rocks.
Right? If you put a female monkey and a male monkey together, can that be called marriage?
I don't think so.
Right? If you put 7 people together that are unrelated to each other, or related to each other but they're not actual mom, dad, and children, like if you put 7 cousins together, can we call that marriage? Can we call that a family? And so there seems to be an objective definition of marriage/family, and that is man, woman, and children that they brought to life, and they are caring for those children. And if that is the objective reality of a marriage, then the primary function of that marriage is not very different from heterosexual unions, which is the generation of life and the education of life.
Right.
A homosexual family is incapable of achieving this primary function. In fact, by their mere presence together, it frustrates the primary function of marriage. Therefore, according to natural law theory, we should be able to say that homosexual unions, including homosexual marriages, are still immoral.
So I think there will probably be some issue taken up with the idea of the primary function and using something away from its primary function. Someone will say, well, licking a stamp is not the primary function of the tongue, or
Right.
getting a piercing in your ear is not the primary function of the ear.
Right. However, the follow-up question would be, does licking a stamp impede? Does it frustrate the primary function of the tongue, which is tasting or speaking?
I guess it wouldn't.
It would not.
No.
You're going to lick a stamp or lick an envelope or whatever, and then just be done with it. It did not prevent the tongue from performing its primary function. It did not prohibit the tongue. What is the primary function of the ear?
To hear.
To hear. An earring, although is not the primary function of the ear, it does not impede the primary function. It does not frustrate the primary function. Therefore, according to natural law theory, licking stamps or piercings in the ear for women would be considered a immoral act, or at least it's not immoral.
So just to come up with an idea that would be a true frustration if somebody were to lick something that would maybe disable them from speaking.
Or someone who uses their teeth to open a can
and ruins their teeth.
and ruins their entire teeth, for example. That would be not only immoral, I think it would be foolish.
Yes, that would be, I think. What about the couple then, a heterosexual couple that got married and they wanted to have children, but now they realize they cannot conceive?
You see, in order for us to characterize an act as immoral, we have to establish intentionality. And so you cannot be forced to something with a gun to your head, and then we would call your action immoral. Right? You have to be intentional, you have to be responsible, the action has to be well within your control.
Right.
A heterosexual couple that is infertile or sterile or incapable of having children come together with the best of intentions. They actually want to have children, but it was imposed on them by God, by nature, whatever, not to have children. Therefore, they are not morally responsible for the outcome, in which case having a sexual relationship between such couple would not be an immoral act.
So what about the couple then that is married, a heterosexual couple, and they're using contraceptives because they don't want to have another child right now?
So the primary function, as we said earlier, of marriage, the primary function of sex or the sex organ is procreation, right? And procreation involves the generation of life and the education of life, right? If a couple uses contraception, otherwise they would have children. Maybe they had 3 children, and then they decided not to have any more children, or perhaps they want to space out the kids, and so they use contraception for 1 or 2 years, and then they decide to have children and so forth.
Right. Natural law theory would say this is wrong.
Natural law theory would say that this perhaps temporarily frustrates one of the functions of marriage, which is the generation of life. But it certainly enhances the other function, which is the education of life. And so perhaps if the outcome, every single time, if the outcome of having sex is that someone gets pregnant, I think a lot of people would be discouraged because this would become a huge responsibility. And if the outcome is that someone gets pregnant and that child comes to the world, and then you end up with 35 kids, it will actually impede the ability of the parents to educate. Right. And so a primary part here of the function of the sex organ was frustrated. So in this particular case, I would actually argue that the unfettered usage of the sex organs to have children every single time with absolutely no control would frustrate the primary function of the sex organs, in which case, even though a lot of natural law theorists, by the way, consider a contraception to be wrong, but there's another philosophical way of looking at this that would still make it a moral matter.
Right, the generation and education of life is together. Those two functions have to be coming together. They are
inseparable.
Right, and so
we're not supposed to be rabbits, just assembly line, busting out kids to the world. Right. That's not the function of the sex organ.
And if that was, then many couples, like you said, would be discouraged, and that would perhaps create other issues and struggles for the marriage, potentially causing the marriage to fall apart, and
which
that would also
impede
the primary function.
Exactly.
Right, I think that's actually incredible and very nuanced. And I think we've had a thorough discussion on one of the driving factors, as you mentioned, which is the homosexual ideation. But I think I want us to spend a little time talking about the other driving factor, gender dysphoria, transgenderism. And again, I want to say here that this seems to be a very painful issue, an issue that seems to be causing a lot of people to struggle, at least those who are experiencing this challenge, this struggle. And I cannot help but think of, for example, the person who decided to transition to a different gender and then years later is transitioning back. And I cannot help but think of the impact it's having on children, little children who really have no idea about sexuality at all, and now it's being, they're being exposed to it not only in schools but in entertainment and almost everywhere you look. It seems really, really important, but also a serious struggle.
It's a heartbreak, to be honest with you. I keep hearing these stories every single day, about the transgender community and the factors that drive people to transition and the factors that drive them to detransition. I think over 60%, end up detransitioning. The violence that was exacted upon transgender people throughout the centuries. The pain and the struggle, the mental health issues, the extremely high suicide rates. As men and women of faith, I think we really need to be very nuanced. We need to be extremely careful, and we have to be compassionate as we approach this matter. Just like I said earlier with homosexuality, I think we have to make a distinction between the person, and the struggles that person is going through, and our abstract assessment of their behavior and whether that behavior is moral or immoral.
Agreed. And I think the first thing we need to do is just to understand transgender culture and transgender ideas. What is at the core of this? What is the claim, essentially?
I feel like, in a simple sentence, what the transgender ideation demands of us is unprecedented. Because what we're being asked here is to believe that someone's identification as something else means that person truly is that thing that they wanted to identify as, right? And so if a man says I am a transgender woman, it's not that this person affiliates themselves or that person sees themselves as such. We are asked to believe that that person is a woman in every sense of the word. Almost doing away with any independent or abstract definition of what a woman actually is.
I think what most people understand is that the idea here is that gender is fluid, and because gender is fluid, you can choose your gender. You could be a particular gender or another gender.
That was 10 years ago. That was a while ago. You know, the trans community or the transgender ideation used to suggest that while sex, biological sex, is determined at the time of birth, and gender is a social construct. Right. Today, it's actually not that anymore. Today, it is suggested that gender is some type of a metaphysical affiliation. It's some type of a metaphysical identity. It's a destiny. You're born with that destiny, and at the time of your birth, right? And that your biological sex is a social construct, and is being imposed on you in an absolute disregard of biology and DNA.
So your biological sex is the thing that's being assigned to you, but your gender...
You're born with your gender.
Is predetermined.
And gender and sex are obviously not the same thing. It's predetermined metaphysically, and you adopt that identity at the time of your birth.
Okay, I think I need to take a pause here, because if gender is predetermined, then where is this predetermined gender coming from?
And that's a great question. And the irony here, I think, is that the trans community or people who identify as trans, they need to make up their minds. If you believe in God, and many of them do, by the way. But if you believe in God, then you have to accept that God has decreed upon you your gender/sex at the time of your birth, embedded in your biological sex or your DNA, or either XX or XY.
Right.
And that has been imposed on you by God at the time of your birth, in which case there is no distinction between gender and sex. Gender and sex are the same. It's just two words for the same thing. If you believe in God, then you have to accept that God has decreed that upon you. And if you do not believe in God, then you have no recourse but to accept that the physical world has imposed something on you, because there is no other source of identity. The only identity comes from the stardust. Remember, the only identity that you possess comes from the universe and comes from the physical world, which is your DNA.
Right.
You're not entitled to metaphysical explanations or metaphysical identities if you do not believe in God. And if you believe in God, then you have to accept the imposition of sex upon you at the time of birth by God. So either way, whether you believe in God or reject God, you're actually stuck with your biological sex. And any deviation from that is just, it's unjustified.
It sounds like a kind of, it goes back to the issues of maybe determinism as well, but at least we can say that gender, if you believe in God, is determined. And sex is also determined.
And gender, let's use the word sex.
Okay.
Right? Sex/gender.
Right.
If you believe in God, then it's determined by God.
Right.
And if you don't believe in God, then it's determined by nature.
Right.
Either way, you're stuck with either XX or XY chromosome, and that is really who you are. Anything else is just self-deception.
So then, what exactly is gender identity? What would it mean for someone to say that they're born as a female, but that they suddenly have the sense that they're actually a man, or they've always had the sense that they're a man? How can they make such a claim? How can they know what it must be like?
I have no idea. I honestly don't know what it means to feel as a man without your male sex organs and your male hormones.
Right.
And I don't understand what it means to feel like a woman without your female sex organs and your female hormones. I don't know if there's a third or a fourth or a fifth category of identification aside from your biological sex and your hormones that would determine how you feel about yourself. And I don't even understand how is it that someone feels that they are not who they really are. Mm-hmm. I don't get that. Thank God I'm not in their shoes, so I have no understanding whatsoever, of this.
Yeah. Well, then we also need to then explain what we do see in the real world. You go around and you meet some men who are more effeminate. or you will meet other women who are more masculine. So isn't this maybe somehow lending itself to this idea?
But there's nothing wrong with this. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this because, there are women who are masculine and there are men who are slightly effeminate, and that's fine. There is almost like a spectrum, within each gender, but at the end of the day, a man is a man and a woman is a woman, regardless of how those qualities may change, those personality differences may change, those hormonal levels may change, but you still are who you are.
So maybe it's not even fair to discuss it as masculine or exclusively or effeminate exclusively. These are personality differences, these are maybe perhaps cultural differences, temperament differences, and they're all adding up to look like something else.
Exactly, and if someone has a different understanding, they would just have to make a case for it. The burden of proof would be on them.
Okay, so there is one area that I think is left unaddressed, often unaddressed, unfortunately. These are the cases I mentioned earlier as well, where somebody is transitioning for the second time, that they were transitioning to a different sex, and maybe after the completion of that process, or maybe even part of the way through that process, they are now detransitioning.
I think any process by which we restore the natural order of things, any process by which we're able to enhance the primary function of an object or a being is a meritorious process, is a moral process in and of itself. And so while transitioning is wrong, I think detransitioning, however unfortunate it might be, would still be the right thing to do.
But how do we end up in this position where people are, at some point in their life, realizing that they made a mistake and now are suffering the consequences of it? They will never be able to fully restore who they were. There have been all kinds of procedures done to them chemically and also surgically.
It's the absolute most cruel thing that society is doing to transgender people. Like I said earlier, violence was exacted on the trans community throughout the centuries. And we continue to exact that violence upon them in different ways. Think about it. As a society, we make very clear distinctions between children and adults. And we have these two very separate categories, and they have two separate sets of legal responsibilities and so forth. A child comes to you, a 15-year-old or a 14-year-old comes to you and says, I would like to smoke. We tell them, no, you're too young. It comes to you and says, I would like to own a gun. No, you're too young. I would like to vote. I would like to drive. I would like to drink alcohol. I would like to have consensual sex. We still say no because you're too young. There's an age for those things. You need to take your time, think about it. You're still maturing. You're still figuring things out.
Right.
Only when it comes to transgenderism that we are so eager. If an 11-year-old girl comes to you and says, I would like to be a man, yeah, right away. Bilateral mastectomy and give her testosterone. Testosterone, by the way, that is illegal for adults to take.
Right.
Adults who are fully consenting and responsible for their own action. You cannot tell an athlete, it's okay to take testosterone. We are protecting the adults from themselves, but when it comes to the children, at whim, doctors are required perform the surgery, remove the sex organ, give hormones, put that person through suffering for years and years and years until maybe one day they realize, what have I done to myself? I need to detransition. If that's not cruelty, I don't understand what is.
Yeah, it's incredibly tragic that the violence, like you said, that's being enacted now is through this kind of blanket affirmation. Whatever you say, whatever you think, it must be right, and there's no one to tell someone otherwise or say, hey, you need to slow down, you need to think about this, or even you need help. Let's get you help.
And a lot of people, I think, that struggle with this, they have mental health struggles as well. And they are perhaps not in a position to make major decisions about their lives whatsoever. Not just because they're young, but also because they struggle from mental health issues. So I just don't know how we've come this far as a society.
What about somebody who's born with, let's say, an XY chromosome match? So that they're genetically they're male, but because of hormonal imbalance issues, perhaps in their childhood, or some kind of injury or something like this, that they grew up without the presentation.
Well, they were raised as a girl, for
right.
example.
So
right.
What do we say about in this situation? about transitioning from one gender to the other, or about surgeries and performing surgeries?
Like I said earlier, I mean, we are guided here by the strong premises of natural law theory. And natural law theory basically says that an object needs to be used in a manner that enhances its primary function. And so if that person that is actually a boy but was raised as a girl at some point decides to restore, their natural identity and return to who they really are, that would actually be the moral thing to do for them. There would be nothing wrong with this particular type of gender reassignment.
And once again, I feel like we've addressed this thoroughly, yet I don't find that there's actually an issue for faith. This doesn't present an issue to believe in God at all.
And it shouldn't, right? Unless you are able to show that religious requirements and the natural world or reason or rationality are in contradiction with each other. And I hope that through this conversation we were able to show that what God says, what the scriptures said, what religion argued about homosexual behavior and transgender ideation are not incompatible with our philosophical senses and our rational senses. And if both are compatible, then a very strong case can be made that those actions are not moral.
Absolutely. And Imam, I also appreciate that you've spoken with great compassion today. I hope this conversation will be helpful for those who are struggling. And I thank you once again for an incredible conversation in this incredible series.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.